Hello there ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Hearthstone. It's Aski here for Nerf TV, and today we've got another deck guide for you. Now, I had a viewer ask me a little while ago to create a deck that basically revolved around stealth, and he had a few ideas of his own that he talked about with and I've talked about with myself. The main one of these was playing out a Questing Adventurer, buffing it with the Master of Disguise to give it stealth, and then continuing to play out cards buffing the Questing Adventurer up further, making it into an incredibly powerful card before you attack with it. And it's a really good play. It makes it more protected, it makes it more safe, and it looks really well. However, a deck needs a lot of different options and a lot of different ways to play out cards effectively to make it good. You can't just rely on one gimmick. Now, I've been playing around with lots of different options, and this is the deck that I finally created. Now, if we take a quick look at the mana curve, you can see a lot of early game options. We've got a lot of choice in the very early game, but we do still run into the late game with some good cards. It's a very nice mana curve and very effective. So let's go through what we've got in the deck, and I'll explain how all the cards work together as we go along. So first of all, we have 2 backstabs. This deals 2 damage to an undamaged enemy minion. Really great card for early game removal, and because it is 0 cost, it can be played out very effectively along with Edwin Van Cleef or the Questing Adventurer, because you can be able to buff those cards up without actually playing any cost at all to yourself. Next up we have Cold Blood. This gives a minion +4 attack if you combo it. So that's pretty much what you want to do. Don't really want to ever play this out with just giving it 2 attack if possible. So you play it out, give a minion +4 attack. If you use that on a Questing Adventurer, you're essentially giving it +5 attack and +1 HP because you played a card as well. And that can be an incredibly powerful combination and take that Questing Adventurer up a massive step in its damage potential. So we've got 2 of those in the deck. It can also be used effectively with pretty much any other cards. We've got a few cards that live in stealth, and that can be really useful for them as well. Conceal. We had 2 of these in the deck initially, but I ended up taking one out because I found it not to be that effective. The stealth only lasts for 1 turn, so basically you protect your minions for 1 go, but I found having the second one, it never really came in handy. 1 was occasionally useful, but 2 was just too much, so I ended up taking one of those out. We have 2 Argent Squires. This is in here simply to be a turn 1 minion drop. I love the Argent Squire. He's really good, stays out in the field quite effectively, and can trade quite usefully in the early game. Now we get into the 2 drops. We have 2 Eviscerates, great for removal or damage on the enemy hero. Combo it for 4 damage, that's really powerful. We also have 2 Saps. This returns an enemy minion to your opponent's hand. Great again for some early game removal or into the later game for getting really big powerful minions. In the early game it's good for maintaining board control. In the later game it's better for getting rid of something that's big and scary like a legendary card or a taunt or something like that. The higher the cost of the creature, the better. Next up we have the Defias Ringleader. Only 1 of these in the deck. A lot of decks obviously run with 2. It's a great turn 1 play if you happen to have the coin to coin out the Defias Ringleader and you put 2 minions out in the field straight away, and that's incredibly difficult for the enemy to deal with. However, it's a little bit overkill and to have 2 in this deck because it's not really one of the main themes. It's a great turn 1 play if possible, but if not, it doesn't really matter too much. You don't need to rely on that. That's why we had the Argent Squire in there as a turn 1 option. So we've got 3 minions that are essentially really good on turn 1, and we've got some good early game removal. We also have Nat Pagle in here for some card draw. Again, not a required card. You can trade him out for a loot hoarder or something like that if you prefer. And we also have a final turn 2 drop. This is a Wild Pyromancer. After you cast a spell, deal 1 damage to all minions. In here pretty much to counteract anyone who's playing rushdown decks. So the Hunter rushdown, Warlock rushdowns, all that kind of thing. The Wild Pyromancer is really useful against. His 1 damage will hit everything on the board, so it will hit your minions as well. But you can of course combine this with backstabs on turn 2, so you can actually play it out and get that damage out straight away if you wanted to. Fan of Knives, deal 1 damage to all enemy minions, essentially doing the same thing as Wild Pyromancer. If you didn't happen to draw into him in the early game, you get the Fan of Knives. It also gives you some card draw. Big Game Hunter, destroy a minion with 7 attack or more. Only 1 of these in the deck again. Now he's in here to essentially be really useful for getting rid of giants and stuff like that. Anyone who plays out anything big and scary, Big Game Hunter can come out. Because he's only a 3 cost drop, he's very useful against decks that rush out giants very quickly. So yeah, really useful card. Not a required one necessarily, but I feel in the current meta he's still valid. Once it shifts a little bit, we could probably take the Big Game Hunter out and trade him out for something else. Next up we have the Blood Knight. He basically removes Divine Shields from every minion on the board, and for each one removed he'll gain +3/+3. So that is incredibly powerful if you have a few on the board. Now he's basically in here to make your Argent Squires more useful in the later game, so it brings that card out of just the early game options and brings it a bit later. You can combine it with the Blood Knight to make him very powerful, and it's also great for counteracting Paladins who go very Divine Shield heavy. If you happen to be taking the first turn in the game, they'll often play out a few Divine Shields and hopefully drop their own Blood Knight on turn 3. You can get in there before them and drop your own. Edwin Van Cleef. Now, combo to gain +2/+2 for each other card played earlier this turn. So obviously he's better played if you've played a few cards already. So he's a bit more of a late game card, even though he is only a 3 drop. Do keep in mind though, you could combine it with backstabs and stuff like that to play him out early. And actually if you played it out with one of the backstabs, he'd come out to 4/4 on turn 3, which isn't terrible, but not particularly powerful. Obviously there is quite a few low cost cards, so he can be played out quite effectively on turn 6 and 7 and that kind of thing in a bit more of the later game. Now the Questing Adventurer we've already discussed. The main play for him is to play him out, stealth him and buff him up. Cold Blood is an absolutely fantastic combination with him. Backstab for a 0 cost that's going to buff him up as well is really useful. All these low cost cards are basically in here to help buff up the Questing Adventurer to give them value throughout the entire game. Master of Disguise will give a friendly minion stealth, so again mentioned before, great for stealthing the Questing Adventurer, but it's also really useful for stealthing some of these later game cards. So we do have Ragnaros in here. Stealthing that's incredibly useful because then they can't attack it and he'll just sit there dealing out damage. And you could also re-stealth the Ravenholt Assassin after attacking with it, or Sylvanas Windrunner, so you can pick which enemy minion you're going to attack. He's a really useful card. Do keep in mind you don't want to stealth a taunt or anything like that, because if you do that, the taunt becomes useless and it won't actually have any effect on the board. Now speaking of taunts, like I just said, Sentient Shieldmaster is in here. Basically just slow the game down a little bit around turn 4 and give you something to protect your minions out on the board. Spellbreaker comes in as a silence. Wasn't necessarily required, but I found a few times when it's been an absolute game changer and it's been incredibly useful, so that came into the deck. As your Drake, 2 of these in the deck, +1 spell damage and battle cry of draw a card. So the +1 spell damage is obviously really useful with Eviscerate, really useful with Fan of Knives, but it's also giving you some card draw in the later game, which is definitely useful and something this deck generally lacks outside of Nat Pagle and the single Fan of Knives. The Sunwalker, again a second taunt, basically replacing the Sentient Shieldmaster. He'll be taken off from turn 5 or something like that, and then the Sunwalker is an option for turn 6 to give you another strong taunt coming out of the field. He also trades very effectively, which is the same reason we have our other number 6 card in here, which is Sylvanas Windrunner, another card that trades very effectively with the enemy. Take control of a random enemy minion as a death rattle, so when the card dies it will basically steal one of your enemy minions. Ravenholt Assassin in here is pretty much a finisher card. Great combination is to play it out, attack with it the following turn, and then re-stealth it using the Master of Disguise or Conceal to protect him for another go. Obviously 5 HP isn't particularly high around turn 7, but that 7 damage is quite good. And lastly, Ragnaros the Firelord, one of my favourite cards at the moment, incredibly popular in the meta, and apparently not being nerfed before the release of the game, so that's absolutely fantastic. It's a very strong card, and definitely one I would recommend getting your hands on if you can. He can't attack, but at the end of each turn he deals 8 damage to a random enemy minion. Very strong. Keep in mind that if you buff him with the Master of Disguise, he'll sit in stealth and still launch those attacks and be very difficult for the enemy to remove from the board. So that is our Hidden Killer deck. Now there are a few other cards that might be relatively useful in this deck, but this is what I've finally come up with. Now I have played around with having Shadow Step and Preparation and stuff like that in there. These are quite useful cards because they're 0 cost. They can be very effective at helping to buff up the Questing Adventurer and Van Cleef, but I find this is probably the best way to go. The mana curve is strong, you keep good options throughout the game, and it does become relatively useful. I've played this in ranked matches and won quite a few, but it is an interesting deck and something really good fun to play around with. Now if you've got any other concepts for decks that you'd like to see us test out and see if we can build, let us know, and let us know what you think of this deck itself. But for now, I've been ASCII here for Nerf TV. Thank you for watching.